Good evening. My name is Rudy El Khoury. I'm the Dean of the University of Miami School of Architecture. I would like to welcome you to the first lecture of our spring term lecture program. I remind you actually that we have 3 series in our lecture program. The lunchtime high noon series that is usually dedicated to members of our larger community, including our neighboring institutions and universities. The Monday Currents series showcases the diversity in the field with wide-ranging issues and approaches to architecture and urbanism. And that is in contrast to the Tecnoglass series we are launching for this term tonight that is actually focused on a yearly topic. I take the opportunity to thank our sponsors, Tecnoglass, whose generous support allows us to have a very ambitious program each year. Now, this year's theme is Miami and the Tropical World, where the tropical is not defined in strictly geographical terms, but refers more broadly to a conceptual category. The tropical may be seen as an alternative to the instrumental rationality we usually associate with, so to speak, northern traditions. The tropical refers to the intelligence of vernacular forms and techniques, especially in the way it tackles climate and environmental issues. The tropical also points to emerging economies and the constellation of new challenges and opportunities they bring to the table. Okay. So frankly, I can't think of better candidates to address these themes than our guest speakers tonight, Joshua-Bolchover and John-Lin. Joshua and John direct Rural-Urban Framework, RUF, R-U-F, a research and design collaborative based at the University of Hong Kong that provides design services to charities and NGOs working in China. They are tackling a currently pressing geopolitical issue that is particularly challenging in China. That is the depopulation and decline of villages and small towns due to the massive and rapid urbanization process. They are currently engaged in several projects in various villages, including schools, community centers, hospitals, houses, and bridges. They are also involved in town planning using a participatory method that has productively enlisted the community in the design effort and gained international recognition in major publications and exhibitions that are really too numerous to list. Venice Biennale, Whitney Museum, you name it. So, suffice it to mention that RUF was recently the center of attention at the Chicago Biennial, where they received the prestigious Curry Stone Design Prize. This award was founded actually in 2008 with the mission, I quote, to inspire the next generation of designers to harness their ingenuity and craft for social good. RUF indeed does a great deal of social good due to the effectiveness with which they negotiate building ambitions with difficult environmental, social, and political circumstances. But what sets RUF apart from the growing numbers of firms and individuals who are re-engaging architecture in the social process is the sheer architectural brilliance. What is remarkable, in addition to the genuine and much-needed social good, is the contribution to the language and technology of architecture that RUF is making with its thoughtful and inventive designs. Please join me in welcoming Joshua-Bolchover and John-Lin.
Thanks very much, Rudolf. In case you're wondering, I'm Joshua, and this is John.
Yeah.
We're very pleased to be in Miami. We'd very much like to thank you for bringing us both here, despite the El Nino and various weathers that we hadn't anticipated. But thank you very much for bringing us here.
There was the promise of good weather, but I think this is it. I mean, we have different standards of good. But certainly, I think that Rudolf, is interesting. You brought up the temperamental and the uncertain side of the tropical. And I think there's really this in this aspect of our work. And this kind of feels like we're in a big spaceship to go to China now and look at the kind of, you could say, massive uncertainty there, and to rethink how we think about architecture, not as something which is permanent, but how architecture evolves and adapts to very volatile conditions. So the talk tonight is a reflection on, talk about uncertainty. We only have one slide. Okay.
Did you try the top one?
I did try the top one. I tried right. It's the right one.
Right one.
Okay. Is the result of a choice that we made to try and do architecture at the periphery of the profession. So what does this mean? First of all, it means that we try not to work directly commissioned by a specific client. So to some degree, we've been working a lot with charities. We operate as a non-profit organization based in the University of Hong Kong. It sounds very complicated. It's a kind of Robin Hood act in which we leverage academic funding, we leverage donations, we leverage prizes, all in order to try and conceive of projects. And what happens is that without a kind of direct client and architect relationship, we enter a larger conversation. It's a complex field of competing forces. And our job is to find moments of connection between these competing interests. Also, we literally work at the periphery. In this periphery, we work in the lines between the rural and the urban, a kind of what we call the front lines of the urbanization process. Now, it doesn't mean we don't work in cities, but for example, we'll work in informal urban villages. So we work outside of the established sort of city structure, but we do work with informal systems in the city structure itself. One of the big challenges is how do we, at the scale of architecture, begin to relate to and to respond to the scale of urbanization? So much larger scale forces, how do we begin to relate to that? We've had the opportunity to work on a number of different programs. One of our premises is that we do projects as a means of doing research. So as opposed to research before projects, we do both simultaneously. They can interchange. And we've experimented with programs of houses, schools, villages, community centers, bridges, infrastructure. And in all of this, we find out more about the effects of government policy on the changing landscape of China. We see our projects as prototypes. Our other architects don't like to be copied, but we actually love it when we're copied because we work in these situations where there are no real professional architects. There's no agency for design, and that's our way of influencing it. Our projects are defined through the village. The village is actually the entity that we see as the element we wish to control. So it's always the building, but in relation to the village. Sometimes multiple projects, sometimes singular projects. Now, it really began this period of urbanization with a marriage between socialism and capitalism, which produced this kind of landscape in which the rural and the urban collide, and they become both inseparable. They rely on each other. But this creates a kind of landscape of contradiction. As all stories, Josh and I began with a journey, which was an 8-hour journey from Hong Kong to our first project in Qingmou, China, a small primary school. And along this journey, we observed fields of abandonment right next to rapid development. And we began to try and consider how could we start to work and how this type of landscape would redefine how we position ourselves as architects. And so what we've done is we've organized the talk as a kind of reflection. We've worked in over 20 villages, and we've built about 12 projects. And right now, we've classified them as a series of competing issues or forces. And often we employ contradictory strategies to various sites. So we don't apply a distinct or a strict methodology. It's actually a toolbox of strategies for urbanization. The first pair that I want to present is the, I guess, individual enterprise, collective organization. And this is it begins with a transformation in the village itself. You could say that the shift to a independent economy, villagers going out and beginning to earn money independently, is also reflected in the very look of the village. So an individual fortune, and eventually, of course, the urban fabric actually completely consumes the rural fabric. There's a social transformation. But ironically, it creates a kind of new type of interdependence. Families. Of course, there's the link between the elderly and the young. As more and more people leave, they invest their money primarily in their houses. And so houses can take 10, 20, 30 years, but that's the primary vehicle of investment. This happens all over the developing world. The paradox is that the more people leave, the village begins to empty out, the population declines, but in fact, the buildings start to densify. So there's a kind of strange building boom, very much like what you're having here in Miami. We have a rural building boom happening in China, kind of a very fragile and a very strange and empty sort of building boom. This is, of course, fueled by a change in the vehicle of construction, the concrete frame and brick structure. Of course, this is sort of Corbusier's domino house type, but it never really fulfills the Corbusian dream of adaptation and variety through this kind of construction system. In fact, it fundamentally combined with the fact that villagers do not build their own houses, but they actually hire outside contractors now to build their houses. Architecture becomes a commodity, and we have a situation in which the rural and the urban have become completely indistinct. So they have merged, and you could not be able to tell if this is a rural or an urban condition in China. However, what is unique about China is two policies that keep these two forces from, physically they have become very much one and the same, but politically they're still very, very different. This is actually just an artist that we used to illustrate this, Guo Rongguo, who has taken pictures of people over 50 who were fraternal twins, so how time ages them. But it's very much, I think, reflective of the Hukou policy, which determines whether you're an urban or rural citizen, and your benefits and privileges also get constrained. So it prevents people from fully moving to the city. Now, the rural is also defined by being the place in which you can have collective land rights and collective land ownership. These things are set to change. The Hukou policy is being dissolved slowly. People are being integrated into the cities through a new point system. And this, to counterbalance this flood of people in the city, the government will soon move to developing an individual land rights use policy. So what this means is the commercialization of the village itself, a kind of direct urbanization of the village, an introduction. So a villager could say, they could develop a hotel independently. Before that wasn't possible. You had to lease everything collectively, and that created a lot of problems. The two projects I'm going to use to illustrate this, I think I better speed up a little bit, is on one hand a project which is very much a kind of bottom-up project. It's in a village in which the transformation from the kind of rural fabric to the generic fabric is happening gradually. And we developed a series of prototypes, new house cores, which will enable this process. And the other project is a top-down project in which we have designed a completely new village, a kind of tabula rasa village, as almost a kind of a strange type of program, because tabula rasa cities is something that we are familiar with. But the tabula rasa village is a bit odd, because villages are supposed to pre-exist. But the first project, a very typical village in northern Guangdong province. This is the aerial flyover. And you can see that a lot of the village fabric has been rebuilt. So, they have surrounding landscape, and suddenly you have an incredibly dense urban cluster. We've actually built a community center for this project. What is unique is that the government in 2010 has sped up the process of replacing the old mud houses. You see, the image of some people getting rich and building big houses while others remain poor is not a very nice image for the government. And so there has been a lot of push and drive to kind of equate this, but actually through the building process. 2010, subsidies are given to villagers to tear down their old houses with enough money to build a first floor. So if we trace back the history of this village, which lasts about 100 years, the Chinese courtyard system is a perfect system for both the expansion of the family, and it's a horizontally expanding system. In 1980, the village construction land is constrained. And so what happens, of course, is a kind of vertical expansion. In 2001 was the first concrete house, and after 2010, with government subsidies, more than half of the houses have been replaced. What's interesting is if you look at the village, suddenly you can realize that it has evolved from a situation of individual houses into really a situation of housing. Very diverse housing. Some families have only one house in which many brothers share the same house. So you're living in a kind of apartment. Others still live in a traditional courtyard house. And we imagined, we're still in the process of this project, redesigning a core which adapts, which kind of welcomes the kind of uncertainty of the situation and tries to make quality spaces even within the process of building itself. So the kind of incomplete becomes qualified, and it allows for a kind of transformation of program. These are the cores as they are being developed. We're going to be testing these. This is one of the villagers' houses. But you can see that the architecture has an incredibly strong presence in the village. The dream sort of remains. But it actually, ironically, looks a little bit like Miami, as I now realize. They're dreaming of Miami. This is the second project, which is in the place where the 2008 earthquake, Sichuan earthquake occurred. Again, in many places, the government has done top-down designs, so the entire village together will be wiped out. But what happens in this situation is that when you get a group of people together to plan out their houses, inevitably what happens is everybody wants to have the biggest amount of space. And so this is the most efficient way to give everyone the biggest amount of space with 3-meter or 1.5-meter differences between buildings. This is a village in the north of Guangdong. This is 1 year ago, 6 months later, and 6 months after that. So you see, what has happened is I think there's an erosion of the collective, not just the collective good or the common good, but also the collective spaces. They remain, but they no longer really remain as sort of useful public spaces. And in this village, we basically designed a village which is all about the common good. Kind of top-down village design, various environmental systems, a new type of rooftop. They actually don't have very much land to farm their own vegetables and their own produce. So essentially what's going to happen is these roofs are going to be planted. We had given different options, but the villagers actually really liked the planting option, and they wanted 100% to be planted. So soon the houses are going to support their own fields, their household production. I'll hand it over to Josh.
Okay. Infrastructure has been a key tool, of course, to project these urban processes into rural territory. As Neil Brenner articulates in his book about planetary urbanism, the concept of the city as a kind of bounded entity has become superseded by this differentiated landscape, organized to support the mechanisms and processes of the city itself, the agglomeration of capital, labor, and infrastructure. In China, at the high-speed rail, the push for new highways has been this kind of key mechanism, these key conduits of growth. The roads connect raw materials and also goods and also labor. They allow villagers to migrate into the city to the factories to undertake work. But in this process, things get left out. Even though infrastructure connects, it also can bisect farmland, divide villages, or increase environmental degradation due to flooding. This is what happened in this village in Lingzidi. Although the big push for infrastructure through this highway actually eroded the landscape, created increased flooding, and destroyed some of the more localized bridges that connected the villages with each other, and more importantly, to the marketplace. As soon as that connection to the marketplace got destroyed, these villagers who were growing walnuts in their fields couldn't take their produce to the marketplace itself. So we designed a series of bridges, a series of prototype bridges that could not only just reconnect these villages back to the marketplace, but also provide additional programs. We created additional public spaces into each of these bridge sites. We call these kind of micro-infrastructures as kind of vital nodes to allow for this public programming and also the connection itself to the village. Created a place to stop and pause, to fish, to wash your clothes, or just to have a chat. And of course, this is in stark contrast as a localized connection to the high-speed rail, which just exists above this smaller connection. In the Mulan case, we were faced with a different condition. We had this vast, again, the high-speed rail that connected Guilin to Guangzhou involved huge amounts of quite violent earthworks. Simply, the mountains were cut away, this red earth, which was revealed and deposited at the back of this site. This was a school in the village itself. But despite this new infrastructure that was happening, life in the village itself just continued very much as it had done in the Mao era, still venerating Mao himself. So this extreme earthworks really created this kind of, as I said, this build-up of material right at the back of an existing school. And our project became how to use this earthwork somehow. How could we use it as a material to create a new programmatic landscape, an opportunity to insert new programs, but also control what that earth was doing through bringing in a retaining wall. So the idea was to create a kind of campus-like educational landscape, and you can see that wall at the back, which became this opportunity for new programs to hinge around it. So this wall itself became, just to go back, it became a reed bed wall that was connected to a toilet and filtered the water from the toilet through the reed bed itself before it entered the river. And you can see this contrast in scales between this infrastructure that bisected the village and this more localized micro-infrastructure that we're creating in the village. So strategies that we also deploy go in contradiction to what happens in the village. Instead of using the facade, using the tiles as the main move, we actually use the most expensive tiles on the interior of the building as a wrapper throughout the interior facades. If our concept was really about plugging in these educational open spaces that were linked together, we also wanted to animate them. And we used this silver tile to create that animation as school kids moved around the building. And of course, the outside remains rough as a kind of dialogue with the existing buildings themselves of the village. So both projects really demonstrate the need to consider the increasing numbers of sites within China that have become disconnected or disrupted through infrastructural development. Although the macro infrastructure prioritizes this kind of co-option of rural land into urban processes, we're interested in these tactical insertions of these micro infrastructures that can enable this local connectivity and begin to anneal this fragmented landscape.
Okay, so I heard the word vernacular mentioned a few times. I just happened to have it in one of our slides. Basically, if you consider the vernacular, I think you have to think about this book by Rudolfsky, bringing the beauty, the intelligence of vernacular architecture, trying to inspire from afar architects working in the cities with a new ethos. Well, in our work, it's slightly different because we are actually literally working in these areas of vernacular architecture. We are part of the destruction and the reconstruction of these things. So for us, I think a more appropriate title might be Making Architecture in a Place Without Architects, having to redefine our role. This is a famous a page from the book. I don't know if you recognize it, but it is from China. It's from the Architecture Without Architects. And if you go there today, which we did a few months ago, it looks like this, where the urban fabric is beginning to encroach onto these courtyards. It's a kind of new proto-rural condition. With government funding, again, the villagers have moved out of these kind of old-fashioned mud houses, because in China, it's very important that not only are we modern, but that we look modern, and built a new set of houses over there on the right. But what is interesting is if you talk to the villagers, they still come and use the underground houses in the winter, and they use the new houses in the summer. So there starts to be a kind of hybrid program of above and below, summer and winter, a kind of development. And in this series, I want to talk about the adaptation and the ability of architecture to adapt, or us as architects consciously evolving between the vernacular and the generic, and consciously helping to evolve a process that didn't really need architects before. Other situations, larger collisions between like the kind of way houses, these kind of traditional surrounded way is like a wall, it's a kind of internalized wall house. And in this situation, I don't know if it's clear, but individual families who live in these sections start to rebuild their own section of the house. So it kind of breaks down, it's transforming. Here is a collective process. And what you see is you still see the circular line, the outer ring of houses, but now they have anticipated that they need a lot more housing. And so one of the things is that these types of houses both have potential and they also kind of break down. If you look at the Tulos in slightly further east, this system of housing was designed for defense from outsiders. And now here you have the Tulos, which have become embedded in urban fabric, which has also been sort of pushed through the kind of recent influx of tourism into these areas. And suddenly, the empty space of the Tulo becomes filled with potential. So we've run studios about this. There are moments where it breaks down. It's an urban typology in the rural. So I don't know, you probably know this, but families actually live in a vertical section of the Tulo itself. It's a 3-story house in in a section. And when everyone wants to have a toilet and a modern kitchen and bathroom, then they just subdivide the internal circular ring into a series of pies and fill that up. And so you have this kind of strange, the need to urbanize has also jeopardized the kind of main collective features of this typology. Now, not everything could be considered not working. There are interesting moments, such as this one, in which the tulos are fixed, but there's a real issue of expansion. So, for example, the house which is built outside of the tulo, creating a yard between the tulo wall and the house, or directly plugging into the tulo itself from the outside. And you could say that this image represents very much how we like to think of ourselves as architects in between the sort of generic construction and the vernacular typology, and again, evolving these projects. This is a studio project about reconfiguring the tulo, reinventing the tulo, and it's also about an experience of the power of the collective when all the models come together. So very quickly, 2 projects. One on the left here, which is about evolving the courtyard as a kind of concept. And then with the one on the right, which is a 300-year-old bridge. It's a renovation project. It is not just preservation, but it is the desire to continue to adapt this bridge for the contemporary needs of the town, the house. In this region, all the houses are on plots of land 10 meters by 30 meters. This is in northwest China, in Shaanxi province. And the villagers themselves are gradually transforming their houses. So the old blocks become renovated into animal pens, and the courtyard dissolves, or the old people get to live in the old house, and the young people get to live in the new houses. But we did a research studio where we documented these houses. It's a 3-year project begun with students. And they developed a program. We experimented with the idea of the courtyard as a kind of typology. Could we revitalize the courtyard? When we went to the site with a donor, the villagers asked us if we could provide a pipeline, a water infrastructure from a nearby lake, so they wouldn't have to pay sort of very high government fees for getting water. And of course, this is a kind of immediate need. And after discussion, what we thought was, why don't we enable them by actually building a prototypical house in which we took ideas from various regions of China, and it's a self-reliant house in which traditional systems like the khan, where the bed and the kitchen are right next to each other, the cooking fires, the smoke goes to the bed, it heats up the bedroom. There's kind of like a warm winter core, and then the house expands in the summer. 4 different courtyards, and a roof, which household planting, and very simple moves. I mean, we don't, I guess, do anything too complicated in these areas, but you could say that the traditional houses were pitched, and the new houses they've built are flat. They become flooded. And in this area, it's dry, but there is a rainy season. So what we did was we inverted the roofs. So that's useful. The water collects. It doesn't remain on the roof. And we store it underground. So it's about how do you do a prototypical house which enables a kind of rural self-reliance. And this is one of the transformations which is happening. It's gone, the rural, which is the symbol of self-reliance, has become much more reliant on the urban. Things of the trade in which we build models to communicate with contractors. It was very successful, this model, because we brought this model, showed it to the builders, and they used this model to convince us that it was much too complicated to build this house, too many moving parts. And so they, sort of communicated back. The house is now, it's interesting. I don't have time for this story, but it was originally designed that we would donate it to a needy family. And so the donors we interviewed, we looked at various families, and there were 3 finalists. And we said, family A is, we think, these people should really deserve the house. And the government came back and said, well, unfortunately, they're no longer interested. But we think family C is really the one that you should pick. And family C was kind of the rich family that didn't seem like they really needed a house. And we said, well, how about family B? Come back, let's pick family B. Oh, family B, they also don't want to live there for some reason. How about family C? And eventually, it was a house, but it evolved into a program which is both private and public. So the Women's Federation runs this house, and it has serves women in need. And it's also open to a new cooperative of straw weaving. It's both a public and a private house. So again, this kind of idea that architecture is also open to its own kind of adaptation, And we try to control the right things and not to control other things. This is a 300-year-old bridge in Guizhou province, very famous for its dog hot pot. So it was a long project. But they needed to fix this bridge. And when we unearthed the stone, we saw that over the 300 years, the bridge has been adapted several times. What we proposed was not just to fix the arch, but to try and solve the larger problem of the bridge, which is that it was no longer necessary as the main connection between 2 traditional towns. They had built a highway nearby, and the bridge became basically obsolete. And so it had kind of fallen into disrepair. And we said, well, why don't we try to reprogram it as a kind of park or public space? We used traditional scaffolding, with new cast concrete blocks as the arch, and we developed a new type of paver. So even looking at materials, trying to adapt them. This paver, in its triangular form, could also accommodate varying sizes and differences in terms of planting as a sort of primary program for the bridge. Again, students were involved, much more student-led this project, and we worked to build essentially this bridge. Now it's interesting because if you see there's a little fence in the back, well, they've built a new middle school next to it, actually ongoing while we finish this bridge. And it becomes a place for students to gather and sort of just happenstance to use as a public space. So it's really quite well used.
Yeah, so going a little bit, we've looked at several village sites. Now I want to just take you through some of the larger scale issues and how we've responded in some of the other projects in sites that are about to be urbanized or changed. So on that first journey that John described, when we were taking this trip out to the village, we went through landscapes like this, a very volatile landscape, a landscape very much in transition. And of course, in that process, we get these very strange juxtapositions between different types of fabric. So here, of course, these high-rise residential developments, a kind of suburban model for China, adjacent to these kind of strawberry fields. We get these factory dormitories built alongside these remnants and abandoned fish ponds. And also this type of condition. We actually went on another journey, and we were searching for what had happened in the collapse. This was in 2008. The huge economic downturn had taken place. You open the paper, and it said 20 million people had left Guangdong province alone. So we were thinking, wow, 20 million people, this is going to have a huge impact on the fabric that we were investigating. And we found this village, a village called Jiansha. And we thought this had the perfect evidence of the impact of the economic downturn. And so we tried to find out what happened to this place. Why did this place look the way it did? And we went back. We went back 3 years later, and we were expecting to see a kind of building boom. China had become economically powerful again. And what was strange to us is, on the one hand, yes, we saw that the village had built new high-rises had, on the one hand, developed very quickly, but on the other hand, this residual piece of land here hadn't changed at all. So we began to try and unpick why, on the one hand, this village had grown very fast, and at the same time, nothing had happened. And we learned that this was really about this ambiguity between rural land use rights and urban land use rights. How did that begin to encroach on the village? And this kind of black market and slightly gray moment between how government formal-led processes begin to instigate and transform land versus this kind of very informal but very speedy use taking place by the village. In fact, what had happened was the village had formed a new conglomeration, made a deal with the developer to sell off part of their land to make this new tower, but on the other hand, the government wouldn't let them develop that piece of land because they wanted to develop it as part of a new city fabric. So we're always throughout this landscape dealing with these contradictory forces between this kind of top-down led development and what the village itself wants. And by no means does the village want just nice little houses. It's important to not have a kind of nostalgia for village life in China. These villages are ruthless and they're hungry for money. So a lot of the development has happened because of this desire to gain as much profit as possible for the villages themselves. So when we turn our attention to places like Tongjiang, we were witnessing the same similar types of contradictions. As we went through the landscape, we'd see this kind of clearance zones in preparation for new town development. And we saw lots of bricks, lots of demolition, lots of leftover piles of construction materials just littered the roadside. And we thought for this project for a school, how can we utilize this material a little bit? So our strategy was really to collect that material and use it as a kind of construction for the roof and for the wall. So this is the building, and you can see we deployed rubble on the roof, and we left that as a growing medium, but also to increase the kind of thermal mass on the roof itself. And these are just naturally wind-blown seeds and plants that have grown on top of the roof. And one of our strategies, we didn't know what was going to happen to this site. The government had said they were going to expand this road into a 4-lane highway, so it was really uncertain how this village itself would develop. So we decided to make this quite robust barrier using very generic materials. We used just this cinder block. One of the things we like to do is to utilize these very ordinary found materials in the village, but try to use them in ways that they're not supposed to be used, this kind of misuse of material. So we turned it on its side, and on the one side like this, it is this kind of harsh buffer, but on the, which allows this gap to move through towards the village. But also on the inside, it's very different. It kind of acts as a kind of soft light filter, allowing light to perforate into the kind of corridor that links into the classrooms. And one thing that was quite important about this project was to leave leftover spaces, spaces that hadn't really been strictly programmed. And we did this to allow spaces for the village itself to take them over, spaces for meeting or library spaces, whatever they wanted, or for the school itself to begin to co-opt them and change how they utilize the school. Now, one thing, we do go back to our sites. This is, five years on when it was first completed, to see how some of our strategies have either worked or not worked. But this idea of this barrier and buffer to whatever might happen outside of it enabled this kind of more enclosed, more kind of privatized, private public space to take place for this type of activity. At a very different scale, this was really about a village. Tongjiang was about a village that was being developed, that was about to grow. And another way in Yan'ai, we were asked to develop a school that could really form the anchor of a new development in a tabula rasa condition. The city, the government had decided they're going to build a new city in this rural area, and we coupled up with a Hong Kong billionaire who wanted to design 100 schools in 3 years. And he wanted to rubber stamp these across China. Now, the interest for us, of course, was to say, how can a school provide the basis, the anchor for the rest of the urban development that might take place around it? And how could it allow itself to begin to be part of that fabric itself? So this was the first step. Again, using a kind of wall itself to act as this kind of a barrier within the landscape, as a kind of protection from the life of the school inside. Another interest for us was this school actually accommodated 3,000 students, and that was equivalent to effectively the size of a typical village that we would work in, around 3,000 people. So it was really, how do you create a school that is in itself a village? So given we had to design, not to design, but come up with an idea for 100 schools in 3 years, we had to go for the prototype. The prototype as the driver for the project. And the idea was really that the wall itself would contain the main functional spaces of the school, the classrooms, and the dormitories. But inside this courtyard was really the public life of the school. And each of these projects, which had different sectional conditions, would act as these kind of social activators to this social space. So we have the library block, the administrative block, the drama and arts building, and also the cafeteria. So the idea was to create this kind of campus-like urban space that could also be porous and allow the new residents to also enter and take part in this lifestyle of this kind of campus. And what was interesting was that the guy sacked us. He terminated our contract. We weren't able to see the projects through as we would have liked. But what remained was the diagram of the project. The fundamental programmatic organization still remained. And I think that was interesting for us to think then of prototypes and what does that mean? And how can we instill in all of our projects a very strong diagrammatic intent that would be maintained, whatever the client decided to change materials, alter the window details, that still we had a kind of integrity of the design and architectural concept itself.
Okay. Well, it takes more than buildings, more than density to create an urban condition. And so often we have the density, we have the growing population, the building boom, but the urbanism hasn't really arrived in the village. By that I mean the facilities for the community itself, the facilities for interacting with the outside. So some of the issues that we try to deal with in this process of urbanization is to kind of build up the kind of public programs. And what does a rural institution look like versus a sort of urban public institution? These are questions for us. This is a case study, or just an example. Jian village in northern Guizhou. So the traditional village was victim of a kind of dam construction project. After the Great Georges Dam, the Three Gorges Dam, there's a lot of dam projects that were really sort of unnecessary. It's become a kind of phenomenon. And mostly fed the desire for local officials to be promoted. Well, this village of 100,000 people, residents, was completely flooded. So what they did was they built a town for 300,000 people. And they put these 100,000 people there. Every villager received, in exchange for their land, a shop front. There's a 6-lane highway that ends after 200 meters in a dirt road. This village was meant to be a connection between many other towns. At the time that we came here, it was kind of a very strange and floating kind of a sort of empty mass of buildings. Now, public activities take place, just like in the village, in the empty buildings. But it's really a question of, again, the adaptation of livelihood. I'm proud to say that actually students were arrested while doing the research for this. So unfortunately, I don't we don't have much of the documentation and the interviews. But it was a very interesting case study, but a very sensitive, politically sensitive one. 2 projects that deal with just some basic issues of public space in different ways. One, a hospital, a kind of new prototype for a rural hospital, and the other, the very first project that we worked on, a school. The hospital first. We teamed up with a charity who wanted to do the sort of first charitable hospital, first charitable rural hospital in China. And we developed a hospital recycling bricks from a local factory. It's somewhere, again, caught between these 2 very, very disparate types of fabric, but kind of fits in or blends in with both. And it's a project that, you could say, designs itself. I think we like it. You know, we didn't have to make many decisions. It really happened on its own. Basically, this was the old hospital. So it's a typical building. It's a school. It's whatever it is. It could be a housing. But if you got very sick, then you needed to have one very healthy friend or individual who would carry you on their back up the 3 flights of stairs to the hospital. So they bought this piece of land, an L-shaped piece of land, next to it in order for the expansion. And what we said was, well, you know, let's build the expanded hospital on this L-shaped piece of land. And the cost for putting in an elevator would be the exact same as actually doing a ramp. And we opted for the ramp, which essentially created a courtyard space. We also, at this time, you know, we, like you, like to have fun. And we wanted to play with some of the sort of generic materials, the kind of circle and a square block. We did a type of latex casting mold that could cast variable openings. Here they are. They're reproduced by the contractor. It gives this kind of strange, soft materiality to the hospital, but it also means that there's these 2 screens, one within the courtyard and one outside. And this is really the primary diagram of this hospital. It's a new public space in which there is an old people's home across the street. And now they come to the hospital for exercise because they walk the ramp all the way up to the top and below. And that's the roof. And you can see it's working. It's not many sick people. So it's become very healthy. Maybe they just want to avoid the hospital. Who knows? This is the first project that we worked on. And to say that we have continued to work in this village over this past 10 years. Actually, it's been about a year since we've been there. This is a typical village. The street serves as the main connection. Very dense, new houses, old houses on the other side. We built a new school, a kind of 希望学校. It's a hope school. So at the time, many Hong Kong donors were going to China and just building hundreds and hundreds of small rural schools. This was encouraged by the government. After the Sichuan earthquake, of course, this policy was slowly dismantled, and the school that Joshua just showed you is the new prototype, which is the kind of live-in school for 2,000 students, in which if you live over 500 meters away, then you will actually live in the school and your parents will come pick you up on the weekends. This is a project about incremental development. There are, I think, 9 different pieces to the project, funded by 6 different donors. And it's about a kind of larger strategy, working with various business developers. The village is quite close to Hong Kong. It was chosen initially by this charity. They wanted to do a new sort of called eco school, because it was so poor that they hadn't polluted their land with a lot of fertilizer. And so they wanted to set up a new kind of organic farming project in which then they would sell this back to Hong Kong. So we worked with this, also an education loop and an agricultural loop. I won't go in to explain it. The school is very simple. There was a field of rice terraces. We did a cut and fill. And what we said was, why, rather than the school being a kind of enclosed, always a kind of enclosed entity, what could the school provide to the village by way of public space? So the hospital is kind of, it does the same thing, but through creating a courtyard. This does the opposite. We try to open up the school directly. This is New Year's. Often government officials are very frustrated with us because, as Josh said, we take the expensive materials and we put it on the inside where only the students can see it. In this project, it's a rule that you have to use tile. But what we did was we took cheap cement bricks and we had the villagers paint them different colors and laid them into the walls. So we kind of challenged this sort of mass-produced material through a kind of social process. Underneath the steps is a kind of covered walkway, so during the rain, kids love to play here. The library, which is also a built-up landscape. Yeah. And then Rural Urban Framework really began when Josh and I began to renovate the old school, because that's the first time that we began to take control of the program itself and to reprogram and introduce new programs to these villages. So we took the old school, which was a courtyard building, and we reconfigured it into a community center, and one charity has set up a kind of model household farm. It's a means of teaching villagers better farming techniques. This is somebody from Caldori Farms in Hong Kong doing workshops. There's dormitories. We've brought students there. Apparently there are really big spiders as well, the line dance, and community meetings which take place. So we brought this to become, again, the sort of focus of this old school just happened to be really embedded within the village.
And I think one thing that was interesting about those projects is really about how do you make sure that there is no fence? How do you make sure that there is no boundary that doesn't allow that dialogue between an institution or a school or a hospital with its environment, with the kind of context that is directly around. So whenever the client asks us to design a fence, we always say, yeah, it's coming, and never design it intentionally. Just to conclude, I think we've talked a lot about strategies and tactics within these kind of different contrasting conditions and this volatility of the landscape that we might be in. And I want to turn to this notion of kind of design and research. I mean, it's a kind of topic that's embedded in all architectural schools, particularly with the teachers, is how do you design, or what is design and what is research and what is design research. And one project really got us to think about this in a different way. We embraced a different context and we embraced a different way of working a little bit. So this is to Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. Not Inner Mongolia, but Mongolia, sovereign state. And the problem here is not a problem as in China, which is really about how do the processes of urbanization impact the rural. In this case, the problems are really about how massive rural migration is impacting how the city itself grows. Now, if you're looking for problems, urban problems, come to Mongolia. What's happened is apparently very harsh winters, and the difficulty of maintaining any economy as a herdsman, as a nomadic herdsman, has led to many of the nomads giving up their countryside life, their nomadic lifestyles, and moving to the city. And when they move to the city, they do this. They put up a ger, is what they arrived in, and they build a fence. And every Mongolian national has the right to claim 700 meters squared and own that land. So it's a very different kind of informal settlement compared to what you have in South America, in the favelas, or even in some of the urban villages in China. And these settlements have no running water, they have no sewaging, they have no heating supply, and every tent basically burns coal in these very harsh winters, minus 30 degrees C, burn coal in the ger itself, and it leads to incredible smog, these kind of pea supers that you once might have found in London in the 18th centuries. And people don't have water, so they have to collect their water from these water kiosks, like petrol pumps. You go in, you pay your money, and you get some water out of it. And this is, by the way, this is in the inner city. This is not even in the fringe areas. And as you move out to the fringe areas, of course, the conditions get a lot worse. And as new inhabitants, they begin to populate any piece of leftover land, sloped land, flood land, whatever really is available. And the city, of course, was expecting to be very wealthy. They thought they could be like Norway. They have huge, vast resources of coal, copper, and gold. And the discovery of these elements thought that the government could turn over and become a huge, it has a small population, 3 million people. It really could become, make everyone in the country wealthy. But unfortunately, of course, commodities have dropped. There's huge difficulties between the government and the Canadian investors who found the materials. And so there's reached a kind of stalemate, a kind of stasis. And they made plans. They had huge amounts of top-down planning ideas for making new subways, making new roads, developing new areas. But simply since the commodities have crashed, there's been no way forward. And things have reached this kind of crisis point where nothing is really happening at all. So how did we change the way we worked? Well, in this case, we started with a kind of base layer of research, beginning to understand the basic things that were going on within the context. But then we started design. We started designing a kind of series of prototypes, a series of ideas that then we took with us to Mongolia and met as many people as we could, saying, how about this? What do you think of this? And we started with these ideas. We met with local people, residents, government officials, and tried to get them excited about some of these projects. And at the same time, we began further research into these plots, how people lived. And the key thing was really about this problem between a rural to urban assimilation, between being a nomad to being a sedentary citizen. And of course, many problems arise with that. People that have a nomadic lifestyle have no idea or a different sense of what community might mean in that instance. They have a different concept of what a kind of civic space might mean. They have a different idea of what to do with their garbage. For a nomad, nomads don't have any garbage. They don't have any waste. So when they move to the city, they do this. They keep their own plots very clean, but they deposit them in the kind of leftover spaces, the kind of the gullies, these pits. This was actually built for them to collect the garbage, but dogs go in, people set them on fire. There's huge problems of unemployment. The city is rife with alcoholism. It's seasonal work, so people mainly in the winter just stay in their ger and drink vodka in huge amounts because there's nothing else to do. So we came back and we realized the first problem that we set, we engaged with a client, and they said, well, we need to deal with this issue of waste. Can you come up with a prototype that can act as a collection point, but also somehow begin to anchor the community should things change? And of course, the simplest problem was the government to initiate door-to-door rubbish collection. And that may still happen, but at this point it didn't. So how could you design something that could maybe accommodate this change, this potential change? So we designed these 3 prototypes, there's only 2 up there, in different sites, different what they call ger conditions, from the kind of fringe, the more remote areas, to more inner districts of ger settlements. And we came up with the idea that in the future, though, some of these spaces could then be reprogrammed, that they could accommodate simple shops or simple cafes or simple community space or creche. So should the future change, the building itself could be robust enough to accommodate that change. They started building, we didn't know they'd even started the project. They started building in November. No one built in November in Mongolia except for our client. It's minus 25. They had to heat up the earth in order to remove the earth to dig the foundations. And they additionally had to clad around the building if you can see here, so that the concrete itself could cure. They were using antifreeze in the concrete itself to prevent the water from freezing, and so that the chemical reaction of the concrete could really take place. So out of the three projects, we managed to design and build two. This was really almost like an earthwork, so that the wall would kind of contain the earth. Residents could walk up, deposit their trash in this little pop-up container, and then the truck in the lower levels could pick up the waste materials from below. This is still during the construction. This is a more remote site of Karnal. This is where more kind of rural activities take place. There's cows, there's goats, and people do some small amounts of agriculture in this area. You see the lorry coming to pick up the first trash. This one was a more urban site in Chingolte. The idea here was that in order to negotiate the terrain from the Gur settlement down to the bus stop, the project also acted as a piece of infrastructure, as a ramp down that could take you, and as you passed down, you would be able to drop off your rubbish along the way. And below it would be the recycling center, where people would get a bit of money as in exchange for bottles or plastics. But in a way, this idea was that it was, again, this notion of a kind of intelligent infrastructure that was doing more than just being an infrastructure, and of course that it could change. What happened was the residents were like, great, we've got somewhere to drop our rubbish off, and they dropped the rubbish all over the ramp itself. They thought the ramp itself was the collection for the rubbish, and not they just put it in this nicely designed little flap that we made. So a lot of what we had to do is this process of going back, demonstrating, and showing how people were to use it. It seems the most basic thing, but it did require a lot. And so this was, again, it's beginning to catch on over time. Again, going back, revisiting the sites, we learn more about how people operate and use the area. So we see the collection point and the bus drop-off. And this was the other site. We went back in November, and this is what we found. We found a mound of earth and a dead dog. So the project, in a certain way, is a complete failure. Didn't work. We didn't know why it was knocked down. But this is really the kind of, for us, the challenge now, and how I see this as being a research project, is this is the beginning of the next project. This is the beginning of the project to find out, why did that happen? Why did the project not work? Why did it get knocked down? Who knocked it down? So the act of design, the act of doing a project itself, for us, is research. It's a codependent and vital kind of completely ingrained, a parallel process to what we do. And this project now is to go back. I'm taking a bunch of students in a couple of weeks to experience this weather. And we're going to go back and we're going to try and test new prototypes with residents to see which can catch on, to find out why, again, certain things might work and certain things might fail. So this is really how we want to leave you with this kind of question of how do you negotiate this kind of territory. Okay, thank you very much. Of course, if there are any, yeah.
You were pretty clear.
You were clear. Hi.
Yeah.
School and later development of practice, and I'm just curious how you arrived at this project.
Well, I think as any architecture, a lot by chance. I was teaching at Chinese University at the time. It's a different university, and there was a kind of a competition set up by this charity to do a kind of one-day charrette with students about designing a new type of school. So first, there was already a kind of problem. The charity had recognized they had done the same thing for about 100 buildings. And I was told afterwards, I was selected as the winner. And afterwards, they told me discreetly that they had actually lost count of the tallies. but somebody apparently thought, that I was in fact the winner. And then for, a year, we were going back to this project. Now it takes about 2.5, 3 hours to drive there. It used to take 5 or 6 hours to drive. It was an 8-day, and then right after I got the commission for the school, Josh and I visited together, and that's how Rural Urban Framework began. But we used to have to rush there because the contractor, he would drink heavily during lunchtime, so it was very, very important to get there right before lunchtime. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you had this guy who said, yeah, everything's fine, everything's great. Yeah. And we realized our mistake after a few times.
I think also it's changed. It's changed how we go about doing projects, and that's what I was trying to say in the last one. That first we were kind of responsive, but now we're really a little bit more, in a way, entrepreneurial. Like we're trying to create our own projects a little bit. Yeah. So like going out there with ideas, and then trying to engage and make the project happen. So it's slightly altered in a certain way. Yeah. And Mongolia started because my wife went there and said, this is a really horrible place. I can't stand it here. You should really go. You'd like it. So, you see how things also...
It's very organic. Yeah. I think that we had done something very informally, and we thought, that was kind of fun. Let's do it again. Yeah. How do we keep doing that? And so we're still trying to define what this framework is. We're still building it up.
This is on. Hello. Hi, my name is Locke, and it's really cool that you said you were teaching at Chinese University because that's where my parents actually went to school. I was just wondering, you talked about student involvement a lot, and I was wondering whether, do you guys teach like a class at Hong Kong U right now, like specifically on kind of what you're doing with this framework, or kind of do you kind of employ a lot of the students you teach and involve them in all of the process?
Well, students are guinea pigs. So one of the most effective ways I think we can use the studio is to test ideas and to change it. I think it takes it's more challenging to change your studio year after year based on the theme. So that's, I think, how we try to employ students to do that. But we do. I mean, what's interesting is that I teach a year 1 studio and a year 4 studio in housing, and we look at the same series of sites, at least this semester. So that's an experiment this year in which we have very, very different levels of students doing very different projects. One a house and the other housing to this. Josh is doing an MArch studio on Mongolia. I don't think he knows what he's doing either. Keeps asking me for advice.
But I think it's both. So we have a lab at the university which we employ people to work on our projects, but we also at the same time run studios that students are involved in to look at some of these issues.
But it is a very important part of the process to begin without the brief. I was saying before that one of the things is it begins without a kind of direct client. There might be many clients, and in the chaos, we can take advantage of the government, the village head, the donor. They all have a stake. But if you have one person, like in this case of this billionaire, and he's paying you directly a lot of money, then you also, you get yourself into a kind of relationship unless there's a lot of trust and, over time. But this guy was a garment manufacturer, and that's how he saw architecture. And it would have been far better to make 10 good projects or 3 good projects in 3 years, because those are the ideas that really, permeate. And so we're not paid, so it allows us to say no and allowed us to walk away as well. So
it's important in China.
It depends where we work, and both in terms of location, but also in terms of the village itself, whether it's a project which the government is involved in, or it's just a project that the village designs and builds. But typically we work with a design institute, which we have to do in China. And we basically take the drawings up to a detailed design, and then we don't just hand it over, but we discuss with the design institute out there. There's usually, and it's not like in Shanghai or Shenzhen, which have these big companies that are super advanced. The design institutes that we work with are pretty basic, one or two people shops in a way. So we discuss with them, we go through the drawings, they will use our drawings as base, they will verify everything with the Chinese regulations, and we'll go back and forth. There'll be a whole round of going back and forth. And then when it's under construction, we've approved the drawings, we'll go out there and supervise the construction with the contractor and also with the design institute.
In conclusion, have you had how easy or how difficult is it to deal with very different material than what is the, let's say, vernacular stuff, which is usually concrete? You're reusing the brick, reusing. How easy or difficult is it to do that in the design institute? Is that an obstacle or in fact an advantage?
It can be. I think there's a lot of persuasion that needs to take place and occur. They really like putting tiles on things. They don't like exposed raw materials at all. And we have to push through that and argue for it. So there's a lot of, again, dialogue. Sometimes things happen very quickly, like in the Tongjiang, we actually wanted to make it out of a perforated brick. And they came back, no, earthquake, and we hammered very hard. And then finally the compromise was the cinder block. But actually we were quite happy with the cinder block.
Yeah, I think, and when you say difficulty, there is the logistic difficulty, there's the political difficulty, and then there's the kind of constructional difficulty. But in that sense, our projects are relatively simple, extremely simple in a way. It's something we've learned over time. And also a kind of a lesson is that every time we finish a project, we think we're big failures, and we go into I go into a deep depression, and then over time, all those details that only you see that weren't done right, they give away to the main big idea. And I think that's been a real lesson for us as well. It's also to reevaluate architecture in this respect. We haven't gotten any invitations to build in Switzerland, though, if that's what you mean. It hasn't.
Hello, thank you for the lecture. I was wondering, you spoke about the top-down versus bottom-up approach a lot. I was wondering how you see the architect in that and how you mediate between that.
No, it's a good question. I think one of the things that we get invited to a lot of conferences about changing things socially with this big social agenda, and I think that often people like to sound very selfless. And in those situations, I like to talk about the role of the architect and the importance of the ego, And maybe it's like a personal ego, but I think it's very important that one person is able to tie together very, very different and competing agendas to a singular vision. And so when I think that we have succeeded, means that we have, in some sense, monumentalized what originally was very, very different into something which is very, the same, I guess. I think that is very important to have the strength of will to consolidate this vision. And it's a political process. It's a social process. So, we do community participation to a degree, but we're the designers. They're not. But it generally works very, very well. Yeah. There's tools that we do.
Yeah, no, I was just, maybe you were also talking about top-down as in top-down planning, right? In terms of a government involvement, perhaps. And I think maybe what we try to do, it's interesting that some of our projects actually are in between. You know, they're not purely bottom-up processes, nor are they purely top-down, but we need to get buy-in from both. You know, to make the project successful, we need both stakeholders to be actively involved. And when one isn't, the project somehow breaks down in a certain way. So our job is really to mediate in that role. I mean, I think particularly in the Mongolia case, you know, the top-down is not going to work there at all. They don't have enough money to realize these plans. Yet bottom-up also will not work simply alone. You know, you're talking about how to solve big issues of services or infrastructure, water, sewaging. Like, you can't do that without a kind of top-down buy-in as well. So how do we negotiate between those two, I think, is a really important aspect.
Yeah, you need leverage to make architecture. But essentially, the one advantage we have is time. From a commercial standpoint, we are extremely unproductive. It takes us roughly about 3 years from the beginning of a project to its realization. And the construction period is usually less than 6 months. So there's a lot of time in terms of just setting up the project itself.
Can you say a bit more about, like a minute ago you said something about how they insisted on having tiles, but you preferred to keep exposing the materials, etc. So can you say a bit more about this? Because it seems like there is an architectural project which is really independent of the service that is rendered to the community. So can you please articulate what that project is?
That's a great question. I think one thing I realize is that it's not just the very wealthy who are the patrons of architecture, who love architecture. Actually, we have really sold an idea of architecture to the rest of the world, the developing world. And so there's an image of architecture, commodified image that has been, I think, sold. And I think this is one of the big conversations that often happens. There's an presumed idea. But then after we get past that, I find that actually then it's also extremely open-minded, because then we can start to look at architecture for how it really works. And I think in the commercial world, I was telling you how I secretly have done this big development project recently, that never really goes away. You know, I think the idea that something has to look more expensive than what you put in, there's constantly that calculation. I don't know if I answered your question, but I think there's the kind of idea of architecture is very, very present.
I think it's also to try and make architecture where it doesn't really exist in that way. You know, we're still interested in form. We're still interested in spatial material effects within our buildings. And I think that's driven less about, is sort of pushing at what is feasible within that context. So we're seeing that there is these kind of concrete frame structures, that tiles of it. What can we make within that kind of palette? I think that's trying to push our own work and how we see architecture in these places.
Yeah, I think it has evolved from that conversation. Like the silver tiles on the inside, I mean, it could be very gaudy or it could be very odd in a city, but somehow it kind of works there because it is one of their materials. They are using it. We just inverted it, and somehow we convinced them that we could do this. Yeah, that's interesting.
I think we are done with the questions, so thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.